I kept the depot at Cedar Crossing for 41 years, and if you ask me the one thing I'm proudest of, it isn't the trains I flagged safe or the telegraph keys I wore smooth. It's a single water-stained letter I had no business keeping, and the night I finally handed it across my own counter to the woman it was meant for. But I'm getting ahead of it, the way old men do. Let me start where it started for me, which was a lamp. Every night for 12 years, up the Cedar Valley at the Larkhill place, there burned a single lamp in a north-facing window. You could see it from the Ridge Road if you came in after dark, a small steady gold against the black shoulder of the hills, and every drover and freighter and circuit preacher who ever passed through Cedar Crossing came to know it. They didn't always know the story, but they knew the lamp. Some of them steered by it the way a man steers by a fixed star, and a few of them, the tender ones, took their hats off when they saw it, though they couldn't have told you why. The woman who lit it was Cora Ashby, and she was the finest person I ever knew, and I say that having known a good many. She'd come to the valley as a girl with her father, Tom Ashby, who broke that hard ground at Larkhill with his own 2 hands and an ox named Solomon, and about a bushel of stubbornness. Tom raised her alone after the fever took her mother, and he raised her the way he'd have raised a son he was proud of. She could shoe a horse, read the weather off the underside of a cloud, keep a ledger straight to the penny, and shoot the head off a rattlesnake at 20 paces without spilling the coffee in her other hand. But he raised her gentle too, so that all that competence sat inside her quiet, like a good knife in a worn sheath. You didn't see the edge unless you needed it. And into that valley, the summer Cora turned 19, rode Silas Reed. He came up from the territory with a trail crew, a lean brown young man with a way of sitting a horse like he'd been poured into the saddle, and eyes that took in everything and gave back little. He wasn't a talker, but there was a straightness in him. You trust him to hold your money or your secret or your back in a fight, and know he'd die before he'd fail any of the 3. The crew laid over 3 weeks at Cedar Crossing waiting on a cattle contract that kept getting delayed. And in those 3 weeks, Silas Reed and Cora Ashby fell into the kind of love that doesn't announce itself, that just quietly becomes the shape of the world. I watched it happen from behind my counter, because in a town the size of Cedar Crossing the depot is the parlor, the post office, and the confessional all in one. He'd come in for the mail that never came for a drifting cowhand, just to have somewhere to stand where he might see her walk past on her way from the mercantile. She'd come in to send her father's orders down the line and stay longer than the errand needed. They were shy as 2 colts about it, but I've watched 1,000 people come through those doors, and I knew. The trouble was, Silas had nothing. A saddle, a horse, a Sharps rifle, and about $40 he'd saved by not drinking it. And Cora was Tom Ashby's only child, and Larkhill, poor as it was still a homestead with 200 acres and water rights, and a man who came courting with nothing but $40 and a straight back knew exactly what he looked like to a father. So Silas didn't ask. Instead, the last night before the crew rode on, he walked up the valley to Larkhill and stood on Tom Ashby's porch with his hat in his hands. And he said, Cora told me this years later, told me the exact words, because she'd carried them like a stone in her pocket her whole life, he said, "Mr. Ashby, I've got no right to your daughter and I know it. But I mean to earn the right. Give me 2 years. I'll go north and take the wages a man can't take with a wife along, the drives up to the railheads, the scouting, the work that pays because it might kill you. In 2 years I'll come back with a stake and a name and something to offer her, and then I'll ask you proper. And if she's promised to another by then, I'll wish her joy and never trouble either of you again." Tom Ashby was a hard man but not a stupid one, and he'd watched his daughter's face go bright as a struck match whenever this quiet cowboy was near. He looked at Silas a long while. Then he put out his hand and said, 2 years. Write to her. If you stop writing, she'll know you stopped and she'll be free of you, and that'll be the end of it. But if you keep faith, boy, so will she. I know my girl. They didn't have a wedding, they had a fence. Down at the bottom of the Larkhill land, where the wagon road crossed the property line, Tom had built a rail fence and hung a gate. And it was at that gate, before dawn, that Cora came down in her father's coat to see Silas off. He gave her the only thing of value he owned that wasn't a tool, a little brass compass his own father had carried, the glass scratched, the needle true. He put it in her hand and closed her fingers over it and said, "So you'll always know I'm coming back to true north, which is you." Then he rode north, and she stood at the gate until the dust of him was gone, and that was the beginning of the waiting. For the first year, the letters came. They came stained with rain and rubbed soft at the folds from riding in a saddlebag 1,000 miles. They came weeks late and 3 at a time. He wrote a plain hand and a plainer heart. He wrote about the drives, the river crossings, the price of beef, the men he rode with, and at the end of every one in the same words he wrote, "I am keeping faith. Wait for me. I am coming back to true north." Cora read them at the north window by lamplight, and she started lighting that lamp the night his first letter came, so that if he ever rode in after dark he'd know which window was hers. And she wrote back twice for every one of his, long letters full of the valley and the seasons and the small doings of a small place, and she sent them down to me at the depot to go out on the northbound, and I franked them and bagged them and sent them on their way, hundreds of them across those years, and I never once read a word, though the Lord knows I was tempted. Then the war came. I won't trouble you with the whole of it, because it wasn't our war down here so much as a thing that happened up north and reached down to take our young men and snarl our roads. But what it did to this story is simple and cruel. It swallowed the mail. The roots broke. The coaches got pressed for other work or robbed or burned. A letter that had taken 3 weeks now took 3 months or never came at all, and half the time you couldn't have said which side of the trouble it got lost on. And in the second spring of the war, the mail coach that carried the whole northern bag, every letter that had piled up for 2 months at the junction, waiting on a route that would hold, tried to cross the Cedar at the low ford in the dark, in a flood, with a driver who didn't know the river the way we knew it. The river took it, coach, team, driver, and the whole leather mail sack, gone down the Cedar in the spring flood, tumbling south toward the flats. We found the driver 2 days later, 3 miles down. We never found the coach. And the mail sack, 2 months of letters, from every soul in 3 counties to every soul they loved, we gave up for lost. Somewhere in that sack, we would learn long after, were the last letters of Silas Reed. But nobody knew that then. All Cora knew was that the letters, which had already thinned to a trickle in the war, now stopped altogether. She wrote and got nothing back. She wrote again. Nothing. She told herself it was the war, the broken roads, and for a long while she was right to. But the seasons turned, and the war ground on and then finally ground to its end up north, and the roads healed, and the mail came regular again, and still nothing came from Silas Reed. Her father died that 3rd winter. Cora buried Tom Ashby on the rise behind the house and became, at 22, the sole owner of Larkhill, and the sole keeper of a promise that had gone silent. Now here is the part I have thought about 10,000 times, sitting alone at that depot on the long nights. Any sensible person would have let him go. Everyone told her to. The town, kindly at first and then less kindly, told her the boy was dead in the war or dead on a trail or, worse, alive and married to some girl at a railhead who'd been there when Cora wasn't. The years piled up 4, 6, 8, and the story around Cedar Crossing hardened into fact the way stories do. Silas Reed was dead, or he was gone, and either way he was never coming back, and Cora Ashby was wasting the best years of a good life burning oil in a north window for a ghost. And she had chances. That's the thing folks forget. Cora Ashby wasn't a woman nobody wanted. She was a woman who'd made herself unavailable, which is a different thing. She ran Larkhill better than her father had, put in the almond orchard on the south slope that everybody said wouldn't take and that took, kept sheep on the high ground and a good garden and a straight ledger. And she did it all herself, and she did it well, and a woman like that draws suitors the way a good spring draws stock. There was a widowed freighter, and a young preacher, and a rancher's son with more land than sense, and every one of them she turned away kind and turned away firm. The one who nearly changed the story was Harlan Vance. Harlan came to the valley about the 8th year, a widower with a boy of 9 and a girl of 6 and a good half-section down the creek from Larkhill. He was a decent man. I want to be fair to Harlan because it would be easy not to be. He wasn't a schemer. He was a tired, honest, lonely man raising 2 motherless children and trying to make a hard place pay, and when he looked up the valley at Cora Ashby, he didn't see a ghost's woman. He saw a strong, kind, capable neighbor who'd be a fine wife and a fine mother, and he was right about all of that. And he set himself to courting her the slow, patient way a sensible widower courts, over 4 years, with mended fences and shared harvests, and his 2 children who came to love her like a tree loves the sun. And that's what nearly undid her, not Harlan, the children. Because Cora Ashby had a great deal of love in her and nowhere to put it. She'd kept it dammed up 12 years behind a fence gate and a north window, and Harlan's 2 young ones came at it from underneath, the way water finds the weak place in any wall, and by the 12th year she was more than halfway to giving in. Not for herself. For the boy who called her ma'am in a way that meant something more, and the little girl who'd taken to leaving her a hand-picked bunch of wilted valley flowers on the Larkhill porch every Sunday. That was where things stood the summer Silas Reed rode back into Cedar Crossing. 12 years, near enough to the day, and I was the first one in the valley to know it, because a man rode up to my depot counter about noon on a hot, bright day at the front edge of the harvest, and I did not know him. That's the truth. I'd known Silas Reed for 3 weeks a dozen years before, when he was a lean brown boy of 22, and the man across my counter now was 40, if he was a day. The trail and the war and the years had worked him the way weather works a fence post. He was gray at the temples and burned dark as saddle leather, and there was a long white scar down the left side of his jaw that hadn't been there before, and he'd gone from lean to hard, from a boy to a thing beaten out on an anvil. He wore a Union cavalry coat gone the color of dust, and a face that gave nothing. "I'm looking for the Ashby place," he said. "Larkhill, it still stand." And the voice did it. The voice hadn't changed. It was the same quiet, careful voice that had asked me for mail that never came 12 years before, just to have a reason to stand where he might see her. "Silas Reed," I said. He went still. His eyes came up off the counter and fixed on me, and for just a second something moved behind them, something young and frightened, before the hardness closed back over it. "You know me," he said. "I'm Elias Tull. I kept this depot when you rode through with the Bar M crew. I franked every letter that girl ever wrote you." I put both hands flat on the counter to steady them because I could feel my own heart going. "Son, where in God's name have you been for 12 years? And he told me. Not all of it and not fast. Silas Reed never told anything fast, but standing there at my counter in the noon heat, he laid out the shape of it, and it was worse than anybody in Cedar Crossing had guessed, and better too. He'd gone north like he promised, and he'd taken the killing work, and it had nearly killed him. He was scouting for a freight outfit when the war came, and a man who could scout got pressed into the cavalry whether he had a girl waiting or not, and Silas Reed spent 4 years in the saddle carrying dispatches through country where a letter and a life were the same fragile thing. He wrote her whenever he could. He wrote her from campfires and field hospitals, and once, he said, from the floor of a jail in a town that had changed hands 3 times, on paper he traded his boots for. He kept faith. He never stopped writing. And he never got a single word back, not for the last 9 years. Because, and here is the cruelty of it doubling on itself, his letters went down in the Cedar with that mail coach, so she never got them and stopped believing. And her letters, meanwhile, were chasing an army all over the North Country, forwarded and re-forwarded, and finally just piled up dead in some junction office because the soldier they were addressed to had been reported, in the confusion of a bad winter, killed. They had me dead, Silas said. Some clerk crossed my name off a list. So her letters got stamped deceased, returned to sender, and they'd have gone back to her marked that way, except by then the routes down here were broke too, so they just stopped. Both directions. Everything we sent each other for the last 9 years gone or dead lettered. I wrote into a silence. She wrote to a dead man. He looked at his hands. I got out of the war 4 years ago. Took me 2 years to get well enough of a wound to sit a horse a full day. Took me another 2 to earn the stake I swore I'd bring back because I wasn't coming back to her empty a second time. I've got it now in the bank at the junction, a real stake, enough for a real start. His jaw worked. And I've spent every one of those 4 years telling myself she's long married. 12 years, Mr. Tull. No sane woman waits 12 years on a silent man she's been told is dead. I only came back to see it with my own eyes and then leave her be. That's all I came for. To see her happy with somebody else and go. And that's when I understood the whole terrible machinery of it. 2 people who had each kept perfect faith, each believing the other had let go. He was so certain she'd moved on that he'd built his whole homecoming around not disturbing her. And she was so certain he was dead that she was, that very season, being courted toward another man's ring. I could have told him right then. I nearly did. But I'm an old man now, and I was a middling old man then, and I had learned that there are truths you can't just say across a counter, truths that a person has to be brought to, or they won't hold. If I'd said, "She waited, she never stopped, she lights a lamp for you every night," he'd have thought I was a kind old fool sparing his feelings. He needed to see it. And there was a harder reason too, one I'm not proud of. I didn't know in that moment whether Cora would still choose him. 12 years is 12 years. Harlan's children were leaving flowers on her porch. I had no right to promise this beaten, hoping man a thing I couldn't be sure of. So all I said was, "Larkhill still stands. She still lives there. Ride up the valley, Silas Reed, and see for yourself." And then, because I couldn't help it, I said, "Ride up after dark, and look at the north window." He gave me a strange look, but he nodded, and he touched his hat, and he rode up the Cedar Valley toward Larkhill after 12 years, and I closed the depot early and sat a long time in the dark, praying I'd done right. He came to the fence gate at dusk. Cora told me the rest of that night later, when she could, some of it that same week, some of it years on. So I can tell it true, the way she gave it to me. She was on the porch when she heard the horse. It was that blue hour when the valley goes to shadow and the first lamp gets lit, and she just set the flame to the north window like she'd done 4,000 nights, and she heard hooves on the wagon road coming slow, and she thought it was Harlan, because Harlan came Sunday evenings, and it wasn't Sunday, but who else came up that road? She walked down toward the gate in the last light, and a man was sitting a horse just outside it, not opening it, not coming through, just sitting there in a dusty cavalry coat looking at the house, and she stopped 10 feet from the gate and said, "Can I help you, mister? You're a ways off any road worth taking." And the man said, "I'm sorry to trouble you, ma'am. I was looking for," and then his voice quit because she'd come close enough to see, and he'd come close enough to see, and 12 years fell away and did not fall away, both at once. "Silas," she said. Just that, just his name in the dark at the gate where she'd last said it. He got down off the horse like a much older man, holding to the saddle horn, and he stood on the far side of the gate. He wouldn't come through it, wouldn't presume, 12 years of certainty that she was another man's wife holding him back like a hand on his chest, and he took off his hat and said the thing he'd rehearsed for 4 years. "I came to wish you joy," he said. I figured, a woman like you, 12 years, you'd be settled and happy long since. And that's right, that's as it should be. I've got no claim. I only wanted to see you well with my own eyes before and he couldn't finish it. And Cora Ashby stood at her own gate and understood, in about the space of one breath, the whole shape of the ruin. That he'd kept faith. That he thought she hadn't. that he'd come home not to claim her, but to release her, out of a love so stubborn and so mistaken it had spent 12 years being sorry for a thing that never happened. She should have flung the gate open and thrown her arms around him. That's how you'd write it. But that's not how Cora was, and it's not how 12 years of guarded hope leaves a person. 12 years of being told you're a fool for waiting builds a wall even against the thing you waited for. What came up in her first wasn't joy. It was anger, the deep, shaking anger of the wound, that he could stand there so sure she'd quit him, when she'd burned oil in a window every night since the war for a man the whole world swore was dead. You figured, she said, and her voice was low and terrible. 12 years I wrote you into the dark. 12 years I lit that lamp so you'd know the window if you ever came in past sundown, and you rode up my valley figuring I'd forgotten you, figuring you'd tip your hat and wish me joy and ride off and leave me be. You figured wrong, Silas Reed, and you figured it about me, and I don't know which of those cuts worse. He stared at her. She saw it hit him, the lamp, the window, 12 years. She saw the certainty he'd built his whole homecoming on cracks straight down the middle. Your letters stopped, he said hoarse. Yours stopped, she said. 9 years of silence. They told me you were dead, Silas. A clerk's list, a returned letter, the whole town certain. I buried my father, and I near buried you 100 times, and I never could, because there was no body and no word, and just enough nothing to keep a fool hoping. I wrote, he said. Ma'am Cora, I wrote every week I could hold a pencil. 4 years of war and I wrote you from, and he named the places, the campfires and the field hospital and the jail, the same litany he'd given me. And she stood there and listened and felt the ground she'd stood on for 12 years shift under her, because a woman knows the sound of the truth, and this was the sound of it. Then where are they? She whispered. Where are 12 years of letters, Silas? If you kept faith and I kept faith, where are they? And neither of them could answer, because neither of them knew about the river. They stood at that gate a long time in the dark, the two of them, on either side of a rail he wouldn't cross, and it should have been the end of the wait, and it wasn't, because a wound 12 years deep doesn't close because you finally understand it. It aches worse for a while first. He couldn't make himself believe he hadn't ruined her life by leaving. She couldn't make herself trust the thing she'd wanted so long it had gone from hope to habit to a kind of grief. And there was the matter, unspoken but standing in the dark between them plain as a third person, of Harlan Vance and his 2 children, and the ring she hadn't said yes to and hadn't said no to. She told him he could sleep in the barn. That's all she could give that first night, the barn, and the words, "We'll talk in the daylight when I can think." And he took it, humbly, gratefully, a beaten man given a barn by the only woman he'd ever loved, and she went up to the house and lit the north window one more time and sat by it till dawn, not knowing any more who she was lighting it for. Now if it had just been the 2 of them, they'd have found their way, I believe. 2 people who have kept that kind of faith, given daylight and time, they mend. But it wasn't just the 2 of them, and the daylight brought Harlan. Because it was harvest, and Harlan Vance came up the next morning with his team and his boy to help bring in the Larkhill almonds like he did every year, being a good neighbor and a hopeful man. And he found a hard, gray, scarred stranger in a cavalry coat coming out of Cora Ashby's barn at sunup. I wasn't there for that, but I heard it from 3 people who were, the hands who'd come for the harvest, and they all told it the same, so I'll trust it. Harlan stopped his team in the yard and looked at Silas, and he was no fool either. He'd courted Cora for years. He knew there'd been a boy once, long ago, a boy the town said was dead, and he looked from the stranger to the barn to the house where Cora had just come out onto the porch, and the whole terrible arithmetic did itself in his head in about 2 seconds. You're him, Harlan said, not a question. I'm Silas Reed, Silas said. And Harlan Vance, decent man, tired man, did a decent and tired thing. He didn't rage. He got down off his wagon and he walked up to Cora on the porch in front of God and the harvest hands and the man come back from the dead, and he said, Cora. I've courted you honest 4 years, and I've never pressed you for an answer because I could see you weren't ready, and I told myself it was grief and time and that it'd come. But it wasn't grief. It was him. It's always been him, hasn't it? Even when you thought he was in the ground, it was him. And Cora, who could not lie, stood on her porch between the man who'd waited 12 years and the man who'd waited 4, and said nothing, which was the truest and cruelest answer she could have given. Harlan nodded slow. He looked at the ground. Then he looked up, and this is the part that makes me think there's more good in the ordinary run of men than we credit, he said. Then I won't have you saying yes to me to be kind and spending your life wondering. My children love you. God knows I do, but I'd rather raise them alone than raise them beside a woman looking north out the window her whole life. He put his hat back on. I'll take my team home. I wish you, and his voice caught, same as Silas's had, and he finished it low. I wish you joy, Cora. And the poor man had to use the very words the other one had used, because they're the only words there are. And he gathered his boy and turned his team, and started out of the yard. But here is the thing that near wrecked it all, and it was nobody's fault. It was just 2 proud, wounded people, and a truth still lying at the bottom of a river. Because Silas Reed watched that good man drive off with his boy, watched the tired dignity of him, watched what he was giving up, and Silas, who had spent 12 years certain he'd ruined Cora's life by leaving, looked at Harlan Vance and saw the whole life he'd cost her. A steady neighbor, 2 children who loved her, a home not built on a graveyard of unanswered letters. And the old certainty rose up in him one last terrible time, and he turned to Cora and said, "Let him come back." She stared at him. "That's the life you should have had," Silas said, and his voice was breaking now, the hard shell of him coming apart at last. "A man who was here, children, a neighbor who never once made you wait. Look at what I cost you, Cora, 12 years. Your best years spent at a window for a man who wasn't worth the oil. I've got a stake now. I've got money. I'll settle it on you, on the 2 of you, make it right and go, and you can call that man back in." "Silas Reed," Cora said, "if you finish that sentence, I will never forgive you." He stopped. "You want to talk about what you cost me," she said, and she came down off the porch to him, right up to him, 12 years and a rail gate and a war closing to nothing between them. "You didn't cost me those years. I spent them. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference, and if you don't learn it, you're not the man I waited for. I chose to wait. Every night 12 years I chose it. Not because I was a fool, not because I had no other roads. I had Harlan Vance. I had that whole good life you're trying to hand me off to. It was mine for the taking any Sunday I wanted it. And I didn't take it. Not because you asked me to wait. You couldn't ask me anything. You were dead, remember. I waited because I wanted to. Because a life beside a good man I didn't love looked emptier to me than a life alone with a lamp and the truth of what I felt. That was my choice, and I made it free, and I'd make it again, and don't you dare stand in my yard and try to take it away from me by calling yourself worthless. You don't get to decide my 12 years were wasted. That's mine to decide, and I decide they weren't." He was crying now. A hard man of 40, a cavalry scout with a scar down his jaw, crying in a harvest yard because a woman had told him his life still had a right to be lived. But even then, the doubt held on, because there was still the thing neither of them could resolve. The letters. Where were 12 years of letters if they'd both kept faith? Without an answer to that, some small poisoned part of each of them would always wonder if the other was telling the whole truth or sparing it. Love can survive a great deal, but it starves without truth to feed on, and the truth of those years was still at the bottom of the Cedar River. Which is where I come back into it. They came to me. Of course they came to me. Where else does a truth about lost mail get chased down but the depot? They rode down the valley together that afternoon, not touching, both of them tight as fence wire, and they came into my depot, and Cora put both hands on my counter and said, "Elias, you franked every letter I ever sent him. 12 years. Where did they go? He says he wrote 2. Somebody has to know where 12 years of letters went, and if anybody in this world knows the roads the mail took, it's you. And I'll tell you, my hands started shaking because I did know. Not all of it, but I knew the piece that mattered, and it had been sitting in the bottom drawer of my desk for 9 years, and I'd never had the heart or the right to bring it out. You see, that mail coach that went down at the low ford in the flood, we gave the coach up for lost, and the sack with it, and I told you we never found the coach. That's true. But 3 weeks after the flood, a boy fishing the flats 6 miles down the Cedar snagged something in a snarl of drift in Cottonwood, and it was a single oilskin packet, water-heavy, near rotted through, that had torn loose from the drowned mail sack and lodged in the driftwood while the rest went on down to God knows where. Inside were 4 letters, ruined past reading, all but one letter that had been folded inside a second oilskin wrap, a soldier's careful double wrap, the kind of wrap a man uses when he's writing something he cannot bear to have lost. I dried that letter out flat between 2 panes of glass. I could make out the hand on the outside, water blurred but legible. The direction was to Miss Cora Ashby, Larkhill, Cedar Valley, and the return up in the corner in the same hand, SGT, S. Reed. I'd kept it 9 years. I'd meant 100 times to carry it up the valley to Cora, but every time I'd stopped. Because in those years everyone knew Silas Reed was dead, and I thought, God forgive me, I thought I'd only be handing that grieving woman a dead man's last words, tearing open a wound that was trying to scar. It seemed a cruelty. So I'd kept it, telling myself I'd know the right time, and the right time never came, and the years went by, and I near forgot I had it. The way you near forget the ache of an old break until the weather turns. Now they stood at my counter, the both of them living, and I understood that the right time was a thing I'd been holding in a drawer for 9 years without knowing it. I didn't say anything. I couldn't have. I just turned around and opened that bottom drawer and lifted out the 2 panes of glass with the letter pressed flat and brown between them, and I set it on the counter in front of them, and I said, "The mail coach that carried your letters went down in the Cedar the second spring of the war. Coach, team, driver, the whole sack, the river took it. That's where 12 years of letters went, Cora. Not one of you quit, not one of you let go, the river did it." My voice went. "This one washed up, just this one. I've had it 9 years and I never brought it to you because everyone said he was dead and I couldn't see the use of grieving you with a ghost's last words. I was wrong to keep it. Here's your proof, the both of you. Here's where the years went." They stood staring at that brown flat letter under the glass. Silas made a sound like he'd been hit. "I remember writing that," he said, barely above a breath. "I double-wrapped it. It was," and he stopped and he looked at Cora, and something came into his face that I'd not seen on any man before or since, a kind of terror. "Cora, don't read it. Not with me standing here. I wrote it the worst winter. I didn't think I'd live to. I said things a man says when he thinks it's his last." But Cora Ashby had already lifted the glass. She read it standing at my counter in the long harvest light, and I watched 12 years pass across her face. I watched the anger go, and the fear go, and the grief go, and something come up underneath all of it that had been buried so long it hardly knew how to show, plain naked joy, the kind that hurts. Tears ran straight down her face and she didn't wipe them. When she got to the end, she read the last of it out loud, in a whisper, because I think she needed to hear it in the air, needed it to be a real thing spoken in a real room after 12 years underwater. "I am keeping faith, wait for me. I am coming back to True North, which is you." The same words. The same words he'd said at the gate 12 years before, the same words he'd closed every letter with, written in a field hospital the worst winter of the war when he thought he was dying, wrapped twice in oilskin so the one thing he couldn't bear to lose might reach her. And it had. 9 years late, and by way of a river and a fishing boy and an old man's drawer, it had reached her. Cora Ashby set down the glass and turned to Silas Reed and said, "You held to True North 12 years. And then she said the thing that ended the wait, the thing she'd had no chance to say at 19 because he'd left before she could, the thing she'd carried unspoken through the whole long dark of it. So did I now come home, Silas? You've kept me waiting long enough. And she opened her arms, and the hard man crossed the last of the distance, and I turned around and busied myself with the telegraph key so as to give two people the only privacy a depot can offer, which isn't much, but is offered with the whole heart. They were married in the fall, when the almonds were in. It wasn't a grand wedding. Cora Ashby was never a grand woman, but the whole valley came, because the whole valley had watched that lamp for 12 years and felt, in some way none of them could have put words to, that they'd been waiting too. The circuit preacher married them under the almond trees on the south slope, the trees everyone had said wouldn't take and that had taken. Silas put a plain gold band on her hand, bought with the stake he'd broken himself for 4 years to earn, the stake he'd sworn he'd never come back to her without. And Cora took the little brass compass out of her pocket, the scratched glass compass he'd pressed into her hand at the gate 12 years before, and she'd carried it every single day of the waiting, and she gave it back to him and said, "You won't need this to find true north anymore. You're standing in it." And Harlan Vance came to the wedding. I want you to know that because it matters. Harlan Vance stood at the back with his 2 children, and when it was done, he came up and shook Silas Reed's hand and wished them both joy, and this time he meant it clean, no catch in his voice, because a good man is a good man and time had let him find the grace in it. His little girl gave Cora one last hand-picked bunch of valley flowers, wilted the way they always were, and Cora kept those pressed in her Bible the rest of her life, right alongside a brown flat letter under glass. She had room in her for all of it. That was the size of her. They had 3 children of their own, and near enough 30 years together. Silas Reed turned that hard-won stake into the finest spread in the Cedar Valley, and he was a gentle father and a gentler husband, and the hardness the trail and the war had beaten into him wore away year by year under the steady warmth of a woman who'd waited 12 years to warm it. He never once in 30 years rode in after dark without looking up the valley for the light in the north window. She lit it every night of her life. Old habits, she said, but we all knew better. It wasn't habit. It was a signal that had finally gotten answered, and she kept sending it just for the joy of knowing now that he'd always see it and always come. I kept the depot 20 more years after that wedding, and I flagged 1,000 more trains and wore out 12 more telegraph keys. But like I told you at the start, the thing I'm proudest of isn't any of that. It's a letter I had no business keeping, dried flat between 2 panes of glass in the bottom of my desk, that I nearly threw out 100 times as an old man's foolishness. And that turned out to be the one true thing that could give 2 people back the 12 years a river tried to steal. I've thought about that a great deal, in my own long nights. How near it all came to going another way. How if that fishing boy hadn't snagged that packet, if I'd cleaned out that drawer any of the 100 times I meant to, if Silas had ridden up the valley in daylight instead of dusk and never seen the lamp, if Cora had said yes to Harlan any of the 4 years she nearly did, how the whole thing hung by a thread thin as a scratched compass needle, and held. But it held. Faith held on both ends of a silence 9 years long in 2 hearts that never once had proof and kept believing anyway. And I've come to think that's the truest thing I ever witnessed from behind that counter. Not that the letter surfaced, though it did, but that neither of them ever really needed it to. The letter only told them what they'd each already chosen to believe about the other, against all the evidence and all the town and all the years. She lit a lamp for a dead man for 12 years. He rode home broke and beaten and sure he'd wrecked her life, just to see her happy and go. And when I'm gone, and the depot's gone, and Cedar Crossing is a name on nothing, I hope somebody remembers that once in this hard country, 2 people kept that kind of faith. That there was a window up the Cedar Valley with a light in it that never went out, not through a war, not through a river, not through 12 years of a silence that should have killed it and didn't. You could steer by a thing like that. A great many of us did.